Every year for the last decade, I have set myself a reading goal of over 100 books. But last year, for the very first time in a decade, I didn't set myself a reading challenge, and I didn't set any numerical goals of how much I would read. I mean, obviously I still wanted to read and reading was still a priority, but there were no numbers. I wasn't endeavouring or trying to read a certain number of books in the year. And I didn't do it because I wanted to see how it would impact my reading. It was kind of a little personal experiment. Because I don't have anything to compare the reading challenge to. That's just my default. I always set the reading goal, and I think it's also very normal in reading communities online as well, because Storygraph and Goodreads make it very easy to set your reading challenge. And so when it pops up on the first day of the month, I'm like, yes, absolutely, of course I'm going to set my reading goal. I just wanted to try something different this year, and in this video I'm going to reflect on what I learnt from not doing the reading challenge and whether I am going to go back to reading challenges or not. Today's video is also very kindly sponsored by Skillshare. My reading challenge was in part inspired by one of the creators on Skillshare. Robin Walden is one of my favourite YouTubers. I'm sure that you have come across his content, and if you haven't, then you are massively missing out, because he's a philosophy student and incredibly wise, incredibly insightful, and every single video of his that I watch, I walk away with notes in my little notebook. I've quoted him in my commonplace book before, and so I was thrilled to see that he'd started a Skillshare course. It was his video on slow reading that inspired me to, in the first instance, actually resist the reading challenge and not set myself a numerical goal. This idea of slowness around reading and intentionality about reading definitely comes to the forefront in his course, which I recently did on Skillshare. So this is Robin's course, the one that I did. It's called Back to the Basics, Bringing Intelligent Reading into Your Life, and it was groundbreaking. Honestly, I think everything that Robin releases is, but this was especially great. It basically focuses on reading, methods of reading, specifically philosophy, but it could be expanded outwards and applied to other areas of interest. And it's teaching us how to be selective about the material that we're consuming, and it just gave me a very useful perspective, which I'm bringing into this new year of reading. The course is kind of playing with this idea of creative consumption, which I've been thinking about quite a bit this last month. Creativity is largely about intuition. It's about following directions which interest you specifically and kind of following them just for the sake of following them. Creativity is so linked, inextricably linked to the idea of play, and so living a creative life would be to follow intuition and to follow those areas of interest and be curious, essentially. And I think it's wonderful when we consume literature, film, media in a way which is creative and which does lie in line with our personal interests, which is kind of selective and intentionally so that we're consuming mindfully in line with what we find interesting. And essentially that is what Robin's course is allowing you to do. It kind of gives you the framework for approaching reading in this way. Because of this course, I have been newly inspired with my reading for this year, and I'm actually using the advice that he gives in, I want to say the second or third lesson of the class, in creating a TBR list for philosophy. So I'm using Robin's advice to curate a TBR list of philosophy books for this year. I cannot recommend this class enough, and if you want to take it alongside many others, then the first 500 people to click on the link in the description can get 30 days of Skillshare completely for free. Skillshare is the world's largest learning community, and you can learn practically anything through Skillshare. You can learn social media creation, productivity, skills of reading, commonplacing, which is the class that I released. So yes, link in the description box if you're interested. But this idea of slow reading, this idea of intentional reading, really was what informed my decision to not do a reading challenge last year.
I'm on a mission to read well in 2025, to read the books at the top of my forever TBR, to be intentional with my reading and start the reading year off to a good start. In this January mini-series, which my sister said should be called January Reads, I am prioritising reading and hope that you can join me. And in today's video, I'm going to be reflecting on reading challenges.
So essentially, I just want to talk through now what happened and what I learnt, and there was a lot that I learned actually about my reading practices, and it has been very formative, and I would recommend doing it. So I think the first thing to reflect on is just how many books did I read, and was it different to the past? So in the past, I have read, I wouldn't say every single year for the past 5 or 6 years, I've read over 100 books, and this year I read 98 books, which is surprisingly similar. I did not know how many books I had read until right at the end of the year. It was only right at the end that I counted everything up, and I was actually really surprised and quite shocked to find that it was so close in that ballpark, which to me like suggests that it didn't really have an impact on how much I was reading. I mean, it is quite a big drop from the last 2 years for me. Like last year I read 130 books, so 30 odd books is quite a big difference from one year to the next, but it's not massive, and there are years that I've read about 100, so I was quite surprised that it was so similar, honestly. And I think one of the main reasons that I'm surprised is because I was much more likely this year to pick up longer books. This is the main thing that I noticed. I'd say like by and all I do prefer shorter books to longer books, just because like a long book is such a big investment, and I do like to hear from different authors. I think there's real beauty in being able to condense a story down, like it's going to make it more poetic. If we think of, there are some definitions of poetry which are just like the absence of all of the filler. Like to make poetry, it's the absence of the filler words that you get in prose, and so a shorter book may be more poetic. Not always, because I don't think you could miss out anything from Crime and Punishment, for example. But I think like by and all, I probably did pick up more over 700 page books this year than maybe ever before. Still didn't read a huge number of them because, as I say, that's not my favourite length of book, but I read more than I maybe otherwise would have done. I mean, I don't know, I can't say for certain, but I do think it's something to do with not having a number imprinted, because obviously if you go on Storygraph or Goodreads, if you do track your books that way, it will tell you whether you're on track. So it will say at the bottom, like, you are 2 books behind schedule, or you are 8 books ahead of schedule, or something along those lines, and it can be quite demoralising if you look and it says like, oh, you're 12 books behind schedule. Suddenly you're like, okay, wow, I really need to catch up. And I do think it's then easy to fall into a trap where you become like focused on the extrinsic goal of reaching your reading goal, and as we know, extrinsic motivation is never going to be as like powerful and bring as much joy as intrinsic motivation, like the picking up a book just for the sake of picking it up. Though actually, also having said that, I didn't notice a difference in my motivation to read because of that. Like, I didn't find myself enjoying books more or less, and it was still very much like always on the merit of the book as to how much I enjoyed it. So theoretically, intrinsic motivation is always going to make you more excited to do something, but I didn't really like find that much of a difference. That wasn't like one of the big things I took away from this year. In fact, what I did find is I had far more reading slumps this year, and that could have been for various factors. I did feel quite burnt out after my masters, and I had a big lull in reading around the time that my dissertation was due, but like I feel like I had more reading slumps this year than I've ever had before, and I don't, so I don't know. I mean, like, maybe the kind of the reading challenge, reading goal is a way to like motivate yourself consistently through the year, and honestly I think that was the main drawback, because even though it is a source of extrinsic motivation, I do love the little like bar showing how many books you've read. It like gamifies reading, and reading doesn't need gamifying because by itself it's so fun, but I don't know, I did find it interesting that I had way more reading slumps, and I think the reading slumps really do make sense as well, because you get a small boost of motivation every single time you add a book to your like yearly roundup, and you can see yourself creeping closer and closer to your goal. It's like success leads to motivation, leads to success, leads to more motivation, and without those quick boosts of motivation that you're getting every time you read a book, maybe it's harder to have that additive kind of reading streak, which can come about. I'm not sure. But all of that said, I think my main takeaway was actually to do with how I actually was looking at literature and how I was treating like books, like what a book is. And this is the most important thing that I took away, and the reason why I would say that this was a formative experience, and one that I'm so glad that I did. I became so much less prescriptive about my reading. And that does include long books, talking about the length of books and being more likely to pick up a long book, but also it expanded my definition of what it means to read, and moved my definition beyond just the bounds of, oh, it's a book because it's on Storygraph. Just because it doesn't appear on Storygraph doesn't mean it's not a piece of literature, doesn't mean you're not reading. And of course, like, we all know this in theory, but when you're putting together a TBR list on Storygraph or Goodreads, or when you're tracking books, like, it kind of separates books and just traditionally codex published literature, separates that and puts it on a different plane from the other types of literature which we know exist everywhere, like articles, manuscripts, which I read a lot of this year, individual poems, extracts from books, little kind of like informative pamphlets. And not to say I didn't read this kind of thing before, but I would say that my understanding of these things as reading and as literature did change, because I wasn't like thinking about reading and books through that frame of Storygraph and what Storygraph and Goodreads think of as books. And that was actually really powerful, and it fits as well with a lot of the questions that I was toying with at the beginning of 2024 during my master's degree. Like, I did a module in early modern women's writing and it was excellent. It was just the most amazing thing. I did the module with Dr. Amy Lidster, whose work is also fantastic. And I also went to this seminar on Still Kissing the Rod. It was an early modern women's writing conference which was done in Oxford in February, and kind of reflecting on like the changing of the canon and whether Shakespeare is still like our focal point in early modern studies, and like kind of how far we've drifted from that, if we have. But one of the key questions in early modern women's scholarship at the moment is this idea of what counts as writing and what counts as a piece of literature. There were many women who did publish early modern printed works. Like, contrary to popular belief, you've got people like Catherine Phillips, who was highly respected, highly regarded. Margaret Cavendish, again, respected within her royalist literary circles. I'll just use those two as the example, but Catherine Phillips and Margaret Cavendish were both writing quite traditional kinds of writing. So writing poetry, writing, in the case of Margaret Cavendish, prose fiction as well. And we would quite confidently look at those and say these are both forms of writing. These kind of fit into our traditional canon of what we mean by writing. But many forms of women's writing at the time, just because of various constraints and tradition, wouldn't necessarily come under that same like clear-cut banner of this is literature and this is a book. So for example, like a lot of women's writing would be a manuscript, and just because it's a manuscript and because it's circulated in the home isn't to say that it's not valuable and that it's not a form of literature. And this year I read a lot of manuscripts and read a lot of pieces by early modern women in manuscript, and very much, I'm kind of a very firm believer that that counts as literature and that counts as reading. And of course it does, but I do think like kind of our framework around like what a book is means that it's very easy to discount forms of writing like letters. Again, like hugely prolific, also hugely important, as it's an excellent book called To the Letter. It's very accessible. If you're interested in like epistolary theory, then that's probably the best place to start. But a letter is hugely valuable and will be stored and reread multiple times. Actually, that idea of rereading was the topic of my undergraduate dissertation. So I feel very strongly about this. And all of that to say that kind of theoretically, I've done a lot of research and a lot of thinking about the scope of reading and the scope of literature and how far-reaching it is. Kind of pairing this with like not doing a traditional reading challenge, I've just found that I'm much less distinct and much less linear in how I think of reading and the things that I count as being like literature or kind of coming under books. And I do think it is quite funny that when we're talking about reading and how much we read, we focus on books. And I don't know, what's the alternative to that? Do we say these are all of the pieces of literature that I read this year? Like, it's not quite so pithy, and so I don't know. And I say all of that just to kind of like come back to the point at hand with this reading challenge. I think I was more willing, kind of more excited to read these types of literature because I wasn't tracking everything. Like, if I'm really committing to tracking all of my reading on Storygraph, then I want to track everything, and a lot of the stuff that I read this year can't be tracked, and I kind of think there's like a freedom by not tracking any of it. I wasn't prescriptive about what I was reading, so as I say, I read a lot more articles, a lot more like kind of clippings from old magazines or newspapers, many more extracts from books. I just pick up a book and read a few poems or read a passage, and I really like that form of reading, and I've really enjoyed that form of reading. And I would say that in many ways I've read much more than I have done before, but I'm just not reading in quite as traditional a way as maybe I was. Actually, even something like finishing a book, I was so much more like willing to not finish a book, and if I didn't like a book, then I used to just like stick with a book even if I didn't like it, because I'd already invested the time into it. But I have set a resolution off the back of this year, like, do not finish a book if you don't like it. I try to read the first 40 pages, and if I don't like it at 40 pages, I'll put it down, because there are just so many great things to read. So yes, that is basically what I learned from this year of not doing a reading challenge. As I say, it was really interesting, very formative. I am going to be tracking my reading this year, and I've set a reading goal, but I'm kind of doing it more mindfully. I want to set the goal because I do like quite seeing the progress, and I missed looking at the graphs on Storygraph and things to see like how much I was reading. But I'm going to take it much more with a pinch of salt, and I'm also so aware that this isn't everything I'm reading. One of the hardest things actually as well about like the variable reading, like the fact that Storygraph doesn't have all of literature on it, is keeping track of things and remembering them, because I like to keep a record of what I read, because otherwise like I get mixed up between two books. Like, I'm really bad with book titles. It's the thing I struggle with most when I'm remembering a book. Like, I can usually remember like the content of it and definitely what it made me feel, but I really struggle to connect it to the title of the book a lot of the time. So this is my reading journal, which I like semi-started in September, and I'm committing to fully like kind of filling out the whole of this year. So every single time I finish a book, or I read an article, or I read a very good poem, I will write some reflective thoughts. And this, I think, is the best way to like keep track of reading and what you're consuming if you're not consuming like just books. Also, I'm setting a condition on my reading goal. I don't think setting an unrealistic reading goal or like an ambitious reading goal is personally the best for me. I'd encourage you to like think about whether setting an ambitious reading goal is good for you or not. Because like I don't want reading ever to feel like something pressurizing, and I definitely have felt like in the last few days of a year when I'm a few books behind schedule that like reading can become a bit can become a source of pressure, and I never want it to be a source of pressure. I'm thinking especially towards the end of the year, like if I were 5 books behind my like reading goal in mid-December, I would be quite tactical in my reading choices, like pick up books which were shorter, which were easier, which would help me get to that end goal. And I think that's quite like a widespread experience. I'm not going to say universal, because there will be people who are so good at resisting that, but when you're that close to your goal and you're thinking, oh, if I just read 5 more books I'm going to reach my goal, it's very hard to like pick up a big tome by Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, which you know isn't going to take you to a reading goal. The last like few years I set a higher reading goal than I had done before, like between 130 and I want to say actually one year I did 150 books, I think in 2020, but I'm not going to aim that high because I'm not using this goal for numbers. I'm using it for consistent motivation to make sure I don't fall into a reading slump, and because I like looking at the graphs and metrics on Storygraph because they're just very fun. And actually having the slightly lower reading goal hopefully will encourage me to read more slowly. I don't want to shy away from reading long books, and I don't want to shy away from reading like things that aren't books and that I can't log on Storygraph. And so that's why I'm intentionally setting my goal lower than I think I could set it. But yeah, I hope you found this video interesting or like insightful, or that maybe there's something in here which is useful. I would recommend taking a year off from reading challenges if you have been doing them for the last couple of years. It has been very insightful, and I'm really glad that I did it, even though I am returning to it. I think I would do it again if I found my reading habits changing. Remember as well that I've got like a load of book related videos which are going to be going live on my channel over the next month, so stay tuned if you are hoping to start the year off on the right foot in terms of reading. But thank you again, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week. I should just let you know that it snowed last night, and so there is beautiful snow outside. So as I'm talking to you, I'm looking out over the snow, and it makes me very, very happy, and I just had to show you.